Cuba is on the clock. That is not a metaphor, not a warning, not a geopolitical analyst speculating from behind a desk. Those are the words, the implication, the barely veiled threat coming directly from the President of the United States, Donald Trump, as of March 2026. And if you think this is just political noise, just another headline that disappears by the next news cycle, you have not been paying attention to what is happening in the Caribbean right now, because what Trump just signaled is not a policy proposal. It is a sequence, a roadmap, a countdown that has already started. Let us be precise about what was said, because precision matters here. Trump publicly stated that after the United States deals with Iran, Cuba could be next. Not might be, could be. In the language of American foreign policy, that is as close to a direct announcement as you're going to get before boots are on the ground or ships are in the water. He said the U.S. government would play a significant role in the possible fall of the Cuban government. He mentioned Venezuela in the same breath, suggesting that the new leadership there, referring specifically to Delcy Rodriguez, who has been operating as a key figure in the Maduro successor structure, could be involved in efforts to bring down Cuban authorities. And here is the part that should make you sit up straight. Trump is not just talking about diplomatic pressure, he is talking about oil, about money, about the arteries that keep a government alive. For decades, Cuba's survival as a state has depended on a very specific lifeline. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba entered what Havana called the Special Period, a catastrophic economic contraction that left ordinary Cubans without fuel, without food, without basic medicine. The country nearly broke apart. It did not, but only barely, and only because Cuba found new patrons. First, Hugo Chávez's Venezuela, which began supplying Cuba with subsidized oil in exchange for Cuban doctors and security personnel. That relationship became the backbone of Cuba's economy for over 2 decades. Tens of thousands of barrels per day flowing from Caracas to Havana, keeping the lights on, keeping the buses running, keeping the regime functional. Now Trump is cutting that lifeline. He said it himself. We cut all the oil, all the money, everything coming from Venezuela, which was the only source. And his conclusion was not ambiguous. Cuba is going to collapse too. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States is openly describing the economic strangulation of a neighboring country as a deliberate strategy, and he is predicting its outcome as if it were already decided. That level of confidence either means he knows something the public does not, or he is projecting a plan that is already in motion. And given what has happened in Venezuela over the past year, the smart money is on the former. The Venezuela angle is critical to understanding this entire situation, and most coverage you will find glosses right over it. When Trump refers to Delcy Rodriguez doing a fantastic job and talks about the relationship being great, he is describing a Venezuela that has undergone something extraordinary. The Maduro government, long sanctioned and isolated by the United States, appears to have entered into some form of accommodation with Washington. The details are murky as they always are in these situations, but the signal is unmistakable. A Venezuela that was once Cuba's greatest ally is now, under whatever arrangement exists, potentially being positioned as a participant in Cuba's downfall. If that is accurate, it is one of the most stunning geopolitical reversals in Latin American history. Cuba built its entire post-Soviet survival strategy on Venezuelan solidarity. If Venezuela is now on the other side of that equation, Cuba has nothing left. The sanctions picture is equally important. In early 2026, Trump signed a memorandum specifically designed to tighten existing sanctions against Cuba. These are not minor financial inconveniences. The U.S. embargo against Cuba, which has been in various forms since 1962, already restricts American businesses from operating there, blocks Cuba from the dollar system, and prevents the island from accessing international financing through U.S.-influenced institutions, What Trump is adding is more pressure on top of a structure that was already squeezing, and the timing is deliberate. Cuba is coming off years of economic deterioration, power outages lasting 20 hours a day in some provinces, food shortages so severe that malnutrition is becoming a documented public health problem, a wave of emigration that has drained the island of more than 10% of its population in just the last 3 years, with over 600,000 Cubans fleeing to the United States between 2022 and 2024 alone. The country was already on the edge. Trump is pushing. And here's where it gets really interesting, because Havana's response to all of this has been defiant in tone, but revealing in content. Cuban officials, after facing direct threats from the White House, publicly stated they were not conducting negotiations with the American government. They said it loudly. They said it repeatedly, which tells you something important. They felt the need to deny it. When a government feels compelled to announce publicly that it is not talking to an adversary, it usually means that either talks are happening covertly or that enough people within the Cuban power structure are signaling openness to dialogue that the leadership had to shut that conversation down publicly. Either reading is significant. Either reading suggests cracks. Trump also floated the possibility of what he called a friendly takeover in Cuba. He did not elaborate on what that means in practical terms, but let us think through the possibilities. A friendly takeover, in the vocabulary of American foreign policy, typically means one of a few things. It could mean a negotiated transition in which the current leadership agrees to step aside in exchange for guarantees of safety and possibly some degree of economic relief. It could mean internal military actors within Cuba who are already in contact with Washington agreeing to remove the current civilian leadership. It could mean a scenario similar to what played out in some post-Soviet states, where a combination of economic pressure, popular protest, and international isolation creates the conditions for a government to simply dissolve. None of these are far-fetched in the current Cuban context. All of them are being discussed in Washington right now. The Republican framing around this is also worth examining closely, because it gives you the timeline and the ambition behind the policy. Senior Republican figures have publicly stated that within the next 6 months, Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba could all see their autocratic regimes fall and be replaced by governments aligned with the United States. 6 months. That is the window being discussed. That is the level of confidence being projected. Whether that confidence is based on intelligence, on wishful thinking, or on a combination of both, is a question only those inside the intelligence community can answer. But the fact that elected officials are saying it publicly means the political commitment is real, and political commitment has a way of becoming policy very quickly in the current Washington environment. If you have been following this channel and you find yourself wanting more analysis like this, now is the moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. This story is moving fast, and the context behind every headline matters more than the headline itself. Every week we break down what is really happening in the geopolitical shifts that shape your world, without the noise and without the bias. Click subscribe and stay ahead of what is coming. Now let us zoom out for a second and look at the strategic picture, because the Iran piece of this cannot be separated from the Cuba piece. Trump has been escalating pressure on Tehran since returning to office, reimposing and extending the maximum pressure campaign of his first term, threatening military action if Iran comes close to crossing the nuclear threshold, and building a regional coalition among Gulf states and Israel to contain Iranian influence. The administration believes, or at least projects, that Iran's regime is under severe internal stress, that the combination of sanctions, protests, and military pressure is creating conditions for potential collapse or significant regime change. Whether that assessment is accurate is debated among analysts. What is not debated is that if it is even partially true, the sequence Trump described, Iran first, then Cuba, reflects a doctrine that is genuinely new in scope and ambition. We are not talking about individual regime change operations carried out covertly over years. We are talking about a public, explicit, multi-front strategy to reshape the political map of entire regions simultaneously. The humanitarian dimension of all of this deserves more attention than it gets in most geopolitical coverage. When the United States tightens sanctions on Cuba, it is not the regime's leadership that suffers first. It is ordinary Cubans, the doctors who already cannot find antibiotics, the families already splitting their meals in half, the elderly who are already going to bed in the dark because there is no electricity. Economic warfare is real warfare in terms of human cost, and the Cuban population is bearing that cost right now, today, in March 2026, while this policy debate plays out in Washington think tanks and Republican caucus rooms. The history of sanctions regimes around the world, from Iraq in the 1990s to North Korea in the 2000s, shows repeatedly that populations suffer long before regimes change. And sometimes regimes do not change at all. They simply become more brutal in response to external pressure. Cuba's government has demonstrated a 60-year capacity for exactly that kind of brutal persistence. And yet, the conditions today are different from any previous moment in the last 6 decades of U.S.-Cuba relations. The emigration crisis has fundamentally changed the demographic composition of the island. Cuba is older, more exhausted, more depleted than at any point since the revolution. The generation that built emotional loyalty to the revolution is dying. The generation coming of age now has watched their parents and siblings leave and has grown up with smartphones and social media giving them a window into a world that looks nothing like what they have. The ideological glue that held this system together is dissolving, not because of American pressure alone, but because of time and lived experience. What the United States is betting on is that these internal dynamics, combined with the external economic pressure, are finally sufficient to produce a breaking point. Maybe they are right, maybe they are not. But the bet is being placed explicitly and publicly, which is itself a significant escalation. What happens next will depend on variables that are difficult to predict with certainty. Will Venezuelan cooperation with Washington actually translate into meaningful pressure on Havana? Will internal Cuban military figures make a move? Will the population, exhausted as it is, find the capacity and the organization to force a change? And critically, what does China do? Because China has been quietly deepening its relationship with Cuba over the past several years, and Beijing has its own strategic calculations about whether a U.S.-aligned Cuba on its geopolitical doorstep is an acceptable outcome. China's response to American pressure on Cuba, whether it moves to provide an economic lifeline that neutralizes the sanctions, whether it signals to Cuban authorities that it will provide political backing, whether it simply watches and calculates, will shape how this plays out as much as anything happening in Washington or Havana. This is the complexity behind a headline that most people read in 30 seconds and move on from. This is a story about the future of an island of 11 million people, about the shape of Latin American politics for the next generation, about whether the United States can actually execute a multi-front regime change strategy simultaneously, and about whether the rules that have governed the post-Cold War international order, imperfect as they were, have now been fully abandoned in favor of something harder, more explicit, and considerably more dangerous. The clock is running. The pieces are in motion. And how this ends is not written yet. So I want to know what you think. Do you believe Trump's strategy can actually bring down the Cuban government in the next 6 months? Or do you think the regime will survive again, as it has survived everything else thrown at it for 60 years? Drop your answer in the comments below. This conversation matters, and your perspective is part of it.